Hello there. Thank you so much for attending our webinar today. I'm Marcia Butler, the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. And as you come into the webinar room, we want to welcome you. And I need to do a bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting, are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. We're thrilled to bring you today's educational presentation. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box. The presenter will answer those queries during or after the webinar today as appropriate. If you ask a question in the chat box, go ahead and leave your phone number as well. If we can't get to your question during this event, we'll make sure someone reaches out to you after today's presentation. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. I'd love to introduce you to our speaker today. Peter Lofgren is with Signal Advisors for over 20 years. Pete has partnered with financial advisors and consumers as a subject matter research on various topics, including long-term care risk mitigation. Prior to his current role as Vice President, Life Insurance at Michigan-based tech startup Signal Advisors, Pete held various distribution leadership positions at one of the world's largest global insurance companies, Allianz. He has earned both CLTC and LTCP designations and served as an instructor for Minnesota's LTC Partnership and Medical Assistance Training course. And Peter, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you. And we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Perfect. Thank you, Marcia. So today we're going to be discussing long-term care and chronic illness planning, and specifically in the context of the needs that we found are most commonly coming up for aviation professionals, specifically pilots. So we're going to talk through a broad range of topics, and I would again encourage anybody that is on the line to ask questions, put them into the chat as you think of them. Don't wait till the end because you probably will forget the question. Just pop it in there, and if we answer it through the presentation, then great. If not, we'll have some time at the end to be able to address those. So we can go ahead and advance the slide. So we're going to start by talking about, just broadly speaking, what chronic illness and long-term care and needing assistance with your just mobility and activities of daily living really means. I think it's important for us to have a common understanding of the risk that we're trying to plan for and the risk that we're trying to mitigate before we start talking about specific solutions and different programs that are available to help pay for those costs. Let's advance the slide, please. So we're fortunate in that the federal government has actually codified what long-term care and chronic illness mean. So this is actually part of the tax code. It was codified. I'm now trying to remember which of the tax acts it was, whether it was OBRA or the Pension Protection Act, but it was certainly one of those two pieces of legislation. And so every state in the US, regardless of where you reside, the definition of a chronic illness or long-term care event is standardized. So the definition that we operate off of is once you become unable to perform 2 of 6 activities of daily living, or ADLs, which you can see on the screen, then you are considered a person who needs long-term care help. The easy way to remember these 6 ADLs is that it's the things that you do in the first 20 minutes of every day. And generally, you do these things independently. So if you wake up and the bed is dry, you've already satisfied your first ADL, continence. From there, typically you'll get out of your bed. So you go from a prone position to a seated position and then seated to standing. That's what's referred to in the tax code as transferring. Then you go to the bathroom, hopefully, toileting, which, by the way, includes the act of both getting onto a toilet and getting up from the toilet without help. Then bathing, which is defined as getting into and out of a bathtub independently, and showering. So you don't need to be able to take a bath, but just the act of getting in and out of the tub, wet surfaces and so forth. And then getting dressed afterwards. And then you go downstairs, you go upstairs, you go wherever and have breakfast, eat independently. Of these 6 ADLs, almost universally, the one that tends to go first is bathing. And that's because the physical act of getting into and out of a bathtub with wet surfaces and stepping over that sill, that tends to be very difficult when you start to have mobility challenges. One other thing I will mention, and this is again something that's uniform to all states and all people that are looking at a care need. If you are deemed cognitively impaired as certified by your physician, that is a tripwire to your ADLs. So that would also make you eligible to receive benefits under most of the programs that we're going to talk about today. Cognitive impairment might not impair your body in such a way that it can't function, but because you're no longer able to make maybe sound decisions or stay independent and living without some kind of supervision safely, they consider that to be an eligible situation for long-term care. All right, next slide.
Just
go ahead.
Comment here, or a question. We often talk about these in terms of more elderly people, but of course the question is, does this also apply to people who are younger, who may have a disability or a disabling event that makes them not able to do these kind of things?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good observation. So a statistically meaningful number of people or percentage of people who would be considered receiving long-term care or chronic illness assistance are under the age of 65. So a lot of people that are very young are receiving some type of long-term care services. There is another piece that goes with this definition that's an important distinction to make. So Marche, I'm glad that you brought that up. Where we draw the line between a chronic illness and an acute illness is, do we expect this condition to last 90 days or longer? So if somebody, say, falls, or maybe you get into an accident, maybe you hurt yourself in some way. Usually if you're a younger person, you hurt yourself doing something dumb, frankly. That'd be my case. You slip and fall off a ladder, you break your leg. If you're going to recover within 90 days, that's not considered long-term care. That's an acute recovery benefit. The other thing I would mention too is oftentimes from a risk management or from an insurance or benefit standpoint, when somebody's under the age of 65 and they experience this type of incident where they have a recovery benefit or they have some extended care need, a lot of times that's going to be picked up by disability insurance. So disability insurance and long-term care protection products tend to overlap a little bit depending on a person's retirement age and what coverages they choose to carry or not. So great thing to bring up. Thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that's worth mentioning, only because in the context of broader care needs and support as we age, these are things that tend to go that aren't necessarily codified. So there's another set of different tasks that people perform on a daily basis that we call the instrumental activities of daily living. So these are not codified. These are not like, bathing, dressing, continence, toileting, etc. These are just things that you have to be able to do to maintain your independence and be able to continue functioning in society. So things like going out and shopping for your groceries, balancing your checkbook, which, nowadays, I don't know if people really use paper checkbooks anymore, but managing your finances, broadly speaking. And then just kind of keeping up the house, right? Doing your laundry, tidying up after yourself, that sort of thing. These are different services and different things that we may need help with. They don't necessarily make us claims eligible, but they're services that we could contract out to others that would allow us to maintain independence longer and ideally in a setting of our choosing. So we may come back to this later in the presentation. If I don't come back to it, remind me, but
All right.
IADLs and having that be part of the overall consideration as we're trying to age independently and with dignity, this is a very important topic. So we'll come back to that when we get to claims and benefit eligibility.
Okay.
Another thing that people do tend to overlook or oversimplify would be probably a better way to put it, is care settings. So as we age and as we need more assistance, what settings can that take place in? I think the tendency is for people to look at it in a very binary way. You're either at home, fully independent, living on your own, or you're institutionalized in a nursing home setting. Those are really the two farthest polar extremes of places that you could receive care and places that you could age. So home health care for most people is going to be the preferred way to get help if they're in a situation where they don't need so much hands-on assistance that it can still be done affordably. So oftentimes with home health care aides, you have a licensed caregiver coming in, sometimes daily, sometimes a few times per week, providing a person with some assistance with those ADLs. It doesn't have to be hands-on assistance to be benefits eligible. It has to be arm's length assistance. So a person might still be able to get up out of bed without help, but to do so safely, they have to have somebody kind of within arm's distance or arm's reach to help if they need it. What I will point out about home health care too is that this again is not a black and white issue. If you have somebody else that you live with, spouse or partner, that person might be able to take care of you most of the time, but a home health care aide coming in and providing assistance, even if it's just for 40 minutes in the morning or a couple of times a week to give that informal spousal caregiver some relief, that oftentimes is how we see somebody progressing through the stages of care. So home health care can be a great resource as you're starting to need help, but you don't need help 24/7. Adult day centers are another setting that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about, but have become increasingly popular because they provide an avenue for somebody to have some time where they can get the care and get the attention that they need during the day. So if your primary caregiver, again, is somebody that you live with, maybe it's a family member, and during the day that person has other responsibilities, maybe they have to work, they can drop off a loved one at an adult day center where that person can be around other people. There's social benefits, there's meals provided, there's entertainment provided. And then at the end of the day, they get picked up or they get shuttled back to where they spend the night. And what's nice too about that care setting is that it tends to be a very cost-effective way to provide good quality care because you're not having to have somebody supervised 24/7, but you have that consolidation of people who need help. So you're spreading out the caregiving need. Assisted living is another step in that gradation. Assisted living tends to be that you're able to live independently for, let's say, 90% of the time. And there's just like some tasks that you need to pawn off to others. So assisted living, again, would be something where you have perhaps a nurse on staff who can provide you with things like measuring out medications, housekeeping services, meal deliveries. A lot of times assisted living helps to provide help with some of those IADLs, and they can also step in and provide limited support for ADLs. But it's not quite a full custodial care setting like a nursing home would be. Memory care and full custodial residential setting or nursing home, that's kind of the farthest end of the spectrum in terms of you need the most assistance. Memory care centers are really interesting to me personally because I've had a few family members that have needed memory care, but also just from the standpoint of memory care is great because it's a highly specialized care setting that's intended to serve the needs of that particular patient. When we talk about the different programs that are available to pay for care, an important thing to realize with memory care centers is that oftentimes, especially with government programs, you're not going to have the flexibility to choose a memory care center because that, again, is a specialized private pay setting. Whereas a full custodial care residential nursing home, they're going to deal with everybody with all sorts of different needs. Could be somebody that's in there because they had a stroke, could be somebody in there that had paralysis because of a traumatic incident, could be memory care center, and all points between. And if they accept medical assistance payments, chances are good that you're getting all points between. It's not going to be a specialized setting like a memory care unit would be. All right, next slide. So I touched on this briefly, the notion of informal versus formal care. Formal care would be anybody who has a license to provide this service. So, at the very farthest end of specialization, that would be a medical doctor. But oftentimes you're seeing people in care settings who are registered nurses, LPNs, nurses assistants. There's different levels of specialization in terms of caregivers. But if somebody has a license to provide care, that would be considered formal. If somebody doesn't have a license to provide care, they'd be informal. So informal takes all kinds of different forms. Oftentimes it's a family member, sometimes it's a neighbor, sometimes it's a friend. But if they're not licensed to provide care, then they'd be considered informal. This distinction is important as we're looking at different ways and means to provide care as we age. Who's available to do that? If they are available, how is that going to impact that person? With a licensed caregiver, you don't necessarily have to worry about that, right? Licensed caregiver, it's their job. They're being compensated for their time. It is what it is. And because of that arrangement, typically, if you're putting into place some type of an insurance solution or some type of government program to pay for care, it's only going to provide for formal care because there's that clear distinction that this is a professional being compensated for their time. When we have family members or friends or neighbors or other community support systems providing care as informal caregivers, that's where it becomes a little bit more interesting. Because those people, generally, it's very difficult to provide compensation for their time unless you're paying out of pocket. But we'll discuss that a little bit later. The one thing I would say is, especially for this audience, given the fact that you're pilots and you tend to be very, let's call it geographically nimble, you may live somewhere very far away from the rest of your extended family. So if you needed care, who's nearby to be able to provide that? If you needed care and you say, well, my kids will take care of me. Okay, well, are they going to have to relocate? Are you going to have to relocate? How does that work with aging in place? It's just a consideration to put on your radars, so to speak, because of the unique situation that you're typically in as pilots. Next question, or next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to start to talk about the different ways that you can plan for the sometimes significant cost of providing for long-term care resources. And we're going to talk about the entire spectrum from I'm just going to cut a check out of my savings to government programs, to private insurance solutions, and all points between. So this really isn't meant to be a pitch for any specific solution. It's intended to be educational and provide you a full idea of what's available for you. All right, next slide. So we'll start with the things that everybody, well, eventually has access to. These are not entitlement programs. Medicare is, but medical assistance is not. And these are important distinctions to make. So we'll talk first about Medicare. So provided you've paid in enough quarters from your compensation over the course of your working years, which I would assume pretty much everybody on this line has, you're going to be eligible for Medicare. Medicare does not automatically cover a care need. And even if it does cover the care need, it only does so for a limited period of time and in a limited definition of capacity. So in order to have Medicare pay for, well, first off, let's start by saying Medicare doesn't pay for long-term care. Medicare pays for a recovery benefit, which is almost the exact opposite of long-term care. Medicare will pay at a very maximum for 100 days of care. It will only pay for that care if you have a qualifying hospital stay first. So you have to have a qualifying hospital stay. And then when you transition to needing long-term care services, so you're no longer receiving hospital benefits, but you're now receiving recovery benefits, Medicare will pay up to 100% of the cost for the first 20 days. Days 21 to 100, there's a copay. Now, oftentimes, if you have Medicare supplement insurance, that MedSup policy can pay for some or all of that copay. But regardless of what kind of layering you implement, at day 101, Medicare stops paying any benefits for long-term care services. It's meant to be a recovery benefit. The other thing I will mention with Medicare is that Medicare is generally only going to pay for, well, I shouldn't say only, but it generally pays for recovery benefits that are received in an institutional setting. There are some home care programs. They've been a little more progressive about that the last few years, but it's a little bit harder to qualify for those resources. And what they definitely will not do is they will not pay an informal caregiver. So if you have somebody who's helping you out, they're not going to get paid for Medicare. So again, Medicare recovery benefit. Can we go back to that slide? Thank you. Medical assistance, or Medicaid, is the other main government program that pays for long-term care needs. And Medicaid is not an entitlement program. Medicaid is a welfare program. Medicaid, or medical assistance, as it's called in most states. I live in Minnesota. We call it medical assistance here. There is an asset and an income spend down requirement in order to be eligible for these resources. So if you are a single person, expect to give away all of your assets, I should not say give away all of your assets, because if you gift your assets away, it actually makes it harder to qualify for Medicaid. If you are a single person, you will be required to spend your assets or your income first before Medicaid steps in. As an individual person, you're allowed to keep $2,000 of personal assets. That's really it. You have to spend down the rest. So if you have, a multi-million-dollar portfolio, that's all going to get spent for your care down to $2,000. They will also, if needed, capture your income each month as it comes in to pay for your care before Medicaid steps in. If you are married, there are two things to keep in mind, which are the acronyms on this slide. We were talking before the webinar started that these are really long acronyms, and I try to avoid acronyms on presentation slides, but sometimes you have such a long acronym that there's really no other way to fit the information on the slide. So what these stand for: MMMNA stands for Minimum Monthly Maintenance Needs Allowance, and CSRA stands for Community Spouse Resource Allowance. The MMMNA is based on your monthly income. So if you're married and you need care, but your spouse doesn't, if they're healthy, they're well, they're allowed to keep a bit of your income each month, or a bit of the household's income each month for their own, maintenance and needs. That's what the M and the A come from, right? This varies a little bit from one state to the next, but generally speaking, see, this is what's interesting about Medicaid. Medicaid is a federally governed but state administered program. So each individual state is allowed to make their own rules with Medicaid within the boundary stakes set by the federal government, because the federal government's the one paying for it. So they say, listen, states rule, you're allowed to make up your own rules, but we're going to set budgets and parameters for you because we're the ones on the hook paying for this. So the federal government does set some boundary stakes. The minimum amount that any state allows a household to keep is $2,288.75. So, think about that as a monthly amount cast out over the course of the year. It's not a lot of money, right? The maximum amount that any state allows, and some states just default to the maximum amount, by the way. Some of them, they call it the standard figure. There's a pretty large portion of them that just say it's the standard figure, that's what you can keep. The standard figure, or the maximum, is $3,435. So it's not like a super broad range. So that's the amount the healthy spouse is allowed to keep. All the rest of the income goes to pay for your care, to the extent that you have expenses. And then, and only then, does Medicaid step in. So that's the minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance. The community spouse resource allowance is based on your assets. This is a little bit more complicated, but the maximum that you're going to be able to keep in any state is $137,400 or $137,400. That's the max. Where it gets a little complicated is that 14 states have what they call a 100% rule. So the 100% rule says if you're a healthy spouse, you can keep 100% of your household's assets up to that $137,400 cap. So if my spouse and I have assets that total $100,000, I can keep the $100,000. If we have assets that total $1 million, I can keep the $137,400. That's in a 100% state. So there's 14 of those. The other 36, and I guess the District of Columbia, so 36 plus 1, have what's called a 50% rule, which says that the healthy spouse can keep 50% of the household's assets up to that $137,400. So again, if my household's assets total $100,000, I can keep 50. If my household's assets equal $1 million, I can keep 137.4 because of that cap. So the cap is the same. It's just which of those, I guess, which calculus does your state subscribe to? The bottom line with all of this is that if you need care and you have resources, if you have money, whether that's income or assets, you're going to be required to spend that before the government will step in and provide you with public resources to pay for your care. The other thing that I would mention about both of these programs is that you forfeit your choice of where you want to receive care and from whom you would like to receive care when you enroll for government programs. They're going to tell you where the bed's available, and that's where you're going to go. And that may or may not be close to where you want to be, and it may or may not be the type of care setting that you want to age in. So that's usually the reason that people choose to opt out of trying to qualify for public assistance, is that they want to maintain the freedom of choice, and they want to maintain the freedom to be able to, well, yeah, freedom of choice. That's what it comes down to.
It's interesting how you talk about this and how the healthy spouse can keep a certain amount, but that, I think that would probably be a major problem if their other spouse passes away. What do they have to live on afterwards? So I can see why that can be a major problem.
It becomes a difficult planning process. And there's a lot of, I guess, like what I have seen happen in a lot of cases in Minnesota, especially if somebody starts needing help young enough, you'll see a lot of couples divorcing. And it's not a divorce that's based on how they feel about one another. It's a divorce it's a paper divorce for the purpose of asset preservation or income preservation, which doesn't always work as a strategy, but you do see people doing it, especially in cognitive situations where it's like, this person's starting to kind of slip cognitively. We might just split on paper so that some of this asset and income preservation can kind of be maintained.
And I know that there's, I know we've done several webinars about elder law and about ways to protect some of the assets when so there are ways legally to protect that person, but of course, we're not talking about that today. You're welcome to look those up on our Advice Chaser website. Okay, let's keep going.
Yep, moving right along. So if we assume that public assistance is not the route that we want to take, which for most people would be the case, certainly people that are high income earners, it's going to be the case pretty much unilaterally. What other resources are available to provide for the cost of care, which can be quite substantial? Some things to consider, and this is going to sort of cross all the different solutions that we're going to talk about next. You're always going to be looking at a few different parameters in product design. So the first of those is reimbursement versus indemnity. So those are industry terms, but broadly speaking, what reimbursement means is if you have an insurance policy that pays out benefits, it's only going to pay out benefits up to the amount of costs that you've incurred. So you're only going to get reimbursed when you actually spend money, and it's typically only going to pay for a certain list of prescribed benefits. So if you're receiving care from a licensed caregiver, that's going to be something that's reimbursable. If you're getting meals delivered to your home, that's probably not going to be reimbursable. The benefit of using a reimbursement policy is that sometimes they can be a little bit more cost effective because they're a little bit more restrictive. Indemnity policies pay out a cash benefit prescribed by the schedule of benefits, regardless of your actual costs incurred. So those are based off of your benefit eligibility. Once you're unable to perform your 2 of 6 ADLs or you're certified cognitively impaired, the policy is going to start paying out indemnity benefits each month. It will pay out a monthly benefit regardless of how much you need. Those dollars are then yours to spend. So you want to spend them on licensed care? Great. That's exactly what they're intended for. You want to spend them on yard care? That's also a totally acceptable expense. You want to pay an informal caregiver? Indemnity is the way to go. Because indemnity dollars, you are not told how and where you can spend those. It's just money in your hands and you can apply it where you need. The other things to keep in mind from a benefit consideration or benefit design standpoint, duration of benefits. So how long do you want to have long-term care benefits paid? Statistically speaking, the average length of time a person spends in a nursing home is about 2.8 years. That statistic is oft-cited, and it's one of the most misleading statistics that long-term care professionals provide, because the average is horrendously skewed. First off, it's a statistic that's based on nursing homes, right? Full custodial care, which is kind of the end of the line for most people. It doesn't take into account how long a person maybe stayed at home and received informal care. It doesn't take into account the fact that a lot of times when men enter a custodial care setting, they've already received care at home from their spouse for a period of years. That, by the way, is the reason that men tend to have shorter stays in nursing homes than women, because they oftentimes are the ones that get sick first and then end up getting cared for by their spouse, which, by the way, is why rates are also less expensive for men. So long-term care insurance products are the inverse of life insurance. Life insurance, ladies get a break because women have more favorable mortality than men. Long-term care is the opposite. Men get a break on their morbidity pricing because we tend to die fast. And you'll also see a lot of times discounts being factored in, because if you have a couple, the spouse, the healthy spouse, is assumed to be an informal built-in caregiver. You'll usually see an elimination period. Think of this as your deductible. It's expressed as a number of days. So oftentimes we'll design policies that have a 90-day elimination period because that overlays with the Medicare recovery benefit, right? Daily versus monthly benefits, not much to say here other than a lot of times if you've seen long-term care insurance in the past, it has a daily maximum. It's more common now to see policies with a monthly maximum. And that helps to provide some flexibility, because if you're receiving care a few days a week, you can get more care on those days if you have a monthly benefit than if you have to evenly distribute it out over 30 days. And then the last thing I would say is inflation protection. This is a really big concern when we're looking at long-term care planning in particular. Inflation is on everybody's lips today. It's always been a concern for long-term care because the demand for care services is generally outpacing the supply of caregivers and care beds. So we've seen inflation in long-term care for years that's been well beyond the CPI. Right now might actually be the first time in my career that I've seen ambient inflation as measured by the CPI higher than the cost of care inflation, which I'll take it, right? Any win we can get. But that's something to bear in mind. Like if you're buying this, or you're placing some type of solution to protect yourself while you're in your 50s, the cost of care is going to be very different when you're in your 80s. So you want to make sure that that benefit is increasing over time to accommodate for that. All right, next slide. So we've got a couple different product types in the insurance spectrum. So Medicare supplement insurance, I mentioned this briefly when we talked about public programs. MedSup policies are really only going to help you pay for that copay during the recovery benefit period of Medicare. It's not going to carry your coverage past day 100. So MedSup insurance, highly recommend you take a look at it when you turn 65, because you can get a lot of extra benefits to Medicare for a very, very reasonable amount of premium dollars allocated. And for what it's worth, I don't have a dog in that fight. I've never worked in Medicare supplements, but I will say, like, it's a very useful financial product. I think everybody turning 65 should, take a look at it and consider what would make sense for their needs. But it's not a solution for long-term care. So the next product in that spectrum is traditional long-term care insurance. When you have seen illustrations for long-term care insurance, is probably what you were seeing. Once upon a time, near the beginning of my career, there were roughly 35, 40 companies that offered this type of product. Today, there's 3 or 4. It's a product that has seen a very dramatically shrinking marketplace over the last 2 decades. There's a number of reasons for this that we don't need to go into in this web seminar, because though it might be academically interesting to those of us in the business, as consumers, you probably don't care, and that's okay. Generally speaking, if you encounter traditional long-term care insurance today, today's products, the benefits of those products is that they tend to have a very low entry point. So you pay less premium today. The other thing that's nice about traditional long-term care insurance is that there's lots of levers you can pull. There's a lot of customization. You can really tailor that policy to the individual person buying the coverage. The drawbacks, though, and this again is some of the things that drove a lot of companies to leave this product marketplace, very, very difficult to price. The way that insurance works, broadly speaking, is you take a huge swath of people who all have a very small risk of needing to be protected against a specific loss, and you bundle them all together, knowing that if I have 10,000 people, maybe 2 or 3 are going to need some help, right? That's how life insurance works. That's how your homeowner's insurance works. That's how your car insurance works. Car insurance wouldn't work if every other person driving got into an accident. If 50% of the people on the road got into an accident in any given day, it doesn't work. But that's the math we're working with in long-term care insurance. So there's what carriers have had to do to respond to this is raise rates of insurance progressively each year to keep up with it. And not each year, I shouldn't say that. Every few years, because these rate increases have to be approved by individual states, and the states sometimes push back. But there's a huge increase in premium over time when you buy traditional long-term care insurance. As I alluded to already, there's not that many companies that are still writing it. These companies' products tend to be reimbursement based. And if you end up not using the policy for long-term care, because some of us are going to pass away without ever needing assistance, you don't get any benefit back. Now, personally for me, the way that I look at that type of insurance is that it's a pure risk transfer tool, like my homeowner's insurance, like my auto insurance. I don't expect to get any money back from those. I'm paying a small amount of premium to provide against a very significant but statistically rare financial loss, and I'm okay with that. I don't walk around hoping that my house gets struck by lightning. I just don't. But a lot of people, when they look at long-term care insurance, they think of it differently, and they go, well, if I never use this, I'm going to lose it. All right, next slide. So what other types of products can we implement then to solve this problem? So the 2 types of products that we find ourselves using most often are either life insurance policies with a long-term care or chronic illness rider. There's also annuities that are built with these types of acceleration benefits. That can be a really effective way to have your assets doing double duty. So if you know that you need life insurance anyway, putting a rider on is an incremental cost to something that you were probably going to have to do already. Great example of this that is specific to this audience. Many of you probably have access to a defined benefit pension plan, right? As pilots, you're one of the few industries that still have pensions. Most of the rest of us that don't work in that type of industry, we're all stuck with defined contribution plans. So 401ks, 403bs, and so forth. If you have a pension and you have a guaranteed income stream that will come to you when you retire, oftentimes that pension stream is going to be a little bit higher if you do it based on just your life versus your life and your spouse's life. So your life would be considered a single life payout. If we're basing it on you and your spouse or partner, that's a joint and survivor life payout, which means that if you pass away first, your surviving spouse still gets some income. There's a concept known as pension maximization where depending on the delta between those 2 points, which will vary by individual, vary by pension plan, and vary by the difference in age between you and your spouse, you can take the single life payout in some cases, which is a higher payout than the joint and survivor oftentimes, and the delta between those 2 points is a good deal more than the premium you would pay on an insurance policy to backfill the difference. That's about as far as I want to go down the rabbit hole on that concept, but if pension maximization sounds like something that you need to do in your finances because you want to make sure your income stream continues after you pass away, perhaps for your spouse's benefit, it's worth talking to somebody and finding out more about that. If you're going to put insurance in place to do that sort of thing anyway, adding a chronic illness or a long-term care rider can make a great deal of sense because that can provide extra benefits. The other thing that we're utilizing often is what we call an asset-based or hybrid long-term care product. So an asset-based product simply says, I'm going to park a portion of my money in this tool to help me plan for risk. Might be that you're doing a single premium, you might pay in over a number of years, but the asset in asset-based is going to either be a life insurance or an annuity policy. And if you need care, the insurance company says, here's the deal that we're going to make with you. For the first 2 years that you need care, you'll spend down or, basically exhaust that life insurance policy's benefit or that annuity policy's benefit. So for 2 years, you go on claim, you're getting your own money back. If you still need care, which statistically you oftentimes will, we will continue to pay you benefits for another several years. And you can kind of specify how long you want that to go, anywhere from another 2 years or even 1 year, all the way up to the rest of your life. And of course, the longer you go, the more expensive it is, right? But that's a great and very elegant way to put together a solution to the problem. What's nice about asset-based long-term care products is that they oftentimes, well, almost always, will have a few other things built into them to make sure that you get value back, even if you never need care. So in the case of a life insurance-based, asset-based LTC policy, if you die without needing long-term care, your heirs are going to get a tax-free death benefit back that's greater than the contribution you made in the first place. So you put $100,000 in, your heirs are probably going to get $130,000, $140,000 back tax-free outside of probate. If you decide that your needs have changed and you no longer need long-term care insurance protection, most of these products have a return of premium option. You say, I just want my money back. You get your money back, no penalty. So there's a lot more flexibility built in. And also I should point out, most asset-based long-term care products are indemnity-based products. So they're paying out that cash benefit each month that you can use for whatever caregiving needs you deem appropriate. All right.
Sounds like a lot more options than there used to be over the past several years.
There's much better variety. There's fewer products from fewer insurance companies, but the companies that are building products and solutions to fix this need are building more interesting and more creative and more diverse solutions, which is good for the consumer audience because it means more people are able to find something that makes sense for them versus everybody kind of selling the same type of thing. The last thing I'll mention is self-insuring because we can't have a complete presentation without pointing out that there are people who don't qualify for government programs, who don't purchase insurance and still need long-term care. And that's, by the way, self-insuring, that's your default plan. If you haven't done any other planning for long-term care, this is your plan. You're going to pay out of your own pocket. You may have resources to do that. And there's nothing wrong with paying out of your pocket to pay for long-term care expenses if you have the means to do so. What I oftentimes will ask in response to that plan is, even though you can, is that really how you want to spend your money? Would you prefer to leave that to somebody? Would you prefer to make sure that those funds are available for a spouse's use? Do you want to leave money to your kids, grandkids, whomever? Oftentimes the answer is, well, even though I could pay for this, there might be a more efficient way for me to create a plan and be able to, fuel resources to do so. One thing that is specific, again, to the audience on today's session, what we found, especially during the pandemic years, but it seems like some airlines have continued this behavior. during the pandemic, there was a desire on the part of many airlines to get some senior flight crew accelerated towards retirement, which is a polite way of saying exited from the airline. So a lot of these senior, long tenured flight crew members were getting some pretty lucrative retirement package buyouts. Included in these buyouts were often a large deposit to it wasn't quite an HSA. I forget the specific terminology that the airline used, but it was basically like a lump sum deposit into a account that behaved the same way that a health savings account or HSA would behave, which is to say that those funds could be used tax-free for the purpose of paying for long-term care services, paying for health insurance, paying for medications. I would expect to see airlines continue to utilize this tool for exiting or retiring employees. Now, this audience today being pilots, you're probably going to see it actually in the exact reverse. If I'm reading the tea leaves of the airline industry correctly, and I could be totally wrong on this, so full disclosure, it's my opinion. What was the phrase you used, Marche? However funny, true, or entertaining.
Yeah, we're not going to endorse it there, Pete.
Right. There's no endorsement here. This is just one guy reading the tea leaves. What we're seeing with pilots is because there tends to be a pilot shortage at any given point in time, what the airlines are oftentimes doing is trying to create financial incentives for you all to continue working. So rather than seeing this put out on the table as a enticement for you to retire early, it's more likely that the airline will say, hey, if you fly for another couple years here or another couple months, whatever the timeline is, we'll put $100,000 into this HSA account for you. Just putting it out there that you should keep this on your collective awareness, because those resources have some really distinct tax benefits, right? Usually when you get HSA money, it's being put into the account before taxes. So you didn't have to pay tax on that as compensation. And if you take that money out and you use it to pay for qualified medical expenses, it's also not a taxable distribution.
Yeah.
You can use those funds to pay for qualified long-term care insurance products, and it's still considered a tax-free distribution. So there's some neat benefits that you can implement by using those resources. It may or may not be part of your finances, but I wanted to bring it up because it is something that we've seen in the aviation industry. So that does bring us to the end of the presentation today. I appreciate everybody hanging on the line and watching this. If you're watching it after the live broadcast as a recording, we appreciate your attention. I hope this has been useful to you. So at this point, Marche, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions here. So can you go over again the kind of policies that help reimburse informal caregivers?
Sure. So if you're looking for ways to pay for expenses related to care that aren't considered skilled nursing care, so a non-licensed care professional, which would include informal caregivers, you want to focus in on a solution that pays indemnity benefits. Sometimes this will just be informally referred to as cash benefits. So an indemnity policy just pays out a prescribed monthly benefit each month like clockwork. Once you hit that 2 of 6 ADLs or be certified cognitively impaired, it's just going to pay you X thousand dollars a month in benefits until you either recover or your policy's exhausted.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about, you said that there are different entry levels. Is that because the premiums go up, so it starts slow and then it goes up? Can you talk a little bit more about having different entry levels to come into the long-term care space?
You're talking about for different types of policies?
I'm talking about like as far as pricing goes. So, and I know we can't cite specific prices because
Sure.
This is going to be, the price is going to change from year to year. But can you maybe talk about like if the premiums are level or if they go up? I guess it's different for every policy.
It can be, but broadly speaking, there's many different solutions and many different products out there that range everywhere from, if you have good cash flow, but maybe your assets are not terribly liquid, So if most of your assets are tied up in real estate or they're tied up in a retirement account, you don't really want to liquidate them and pivot it into an asset-based solution. There's products that you could say, well, I have really good cash flow. I've got really good income coming in between Social Security, my pension income, and so forth. Like, I can just allocate a little bit of that each month to pay a premium. So there are products that can be set up to be paid in perpetuity as a monthly premium, annual premium, however you need to structure that. And then there's products that are set up with as few payments as a single premium, which has actually become, for the asset-based long-term care products, that's the most popular way to fund that type of policy, is to just say, okay, well, I've got, a brokerage account over here with X $100,000 of assets. I'm just going to lop off 100,000, put it over here. You're just parking it there in case you need it. And if you don't need it, it comes back to your estate. So there's a spectrum there.
Yeah, really interesting. And I'm assuming you have to game things out and see what would be best for your individual situation.
Yeah, which is fortunately a very easy thing to do. So
especially if someone spends all day doing it.
Exactly. Yep. It should take a qualified professional about 3 minutes to tell you, here's how much it would cost if you want to pay once, here's how much it costs if you're going to pay over time.
Very interesting. All right, and last one here. When is the best time of life to purchase or invest in a this kind of solution? So obviously we'd be thinking about it earlier, but at what time do you say, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get that taken care of?
The day before you need it. Yeah, I've gotten that question a lot of times over the course of my career. And of course, as a life insurance person, primarily for most of the time that I've been in the business. Yeah, that's a question I get often, is what's the best time to do this? Well, the best time to do this would be the month before you die. But for long-term care planning purposes, there is a little bit of a cost benefit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody's in their 30s, chances are very good that your risk is very low, and you could commit the resources to pay for a policy that would protect you, but it's probably not going to be utilized anytime soon. So when we look at people that are very young, so 30s and 40s, my guidance tends to be that if it's something you're concerned about because you had a lot of family members that needed care, like I've had grandparents, and my wife's had grandparents that all needed extensive care at the end of their lives. It's certainly on my radar, but I'm not quite at the age where I want to commit resources fully. So what we do is we utilize, one of the solutions I mentioned was life insurance with a rider. So I have a life insurance policy that has a built-in chronic illness rider. I don't pay any extra premium for it. And it's not true long-term care insurance. It would be an acceleration of my life insurance. But for me at this stage in life, that's not a bad way to utilize the solution available. When somebody starts to get into their 50s, especially mid to late 50s, that's where we start to say, okay, let's do some planning in earnest. Now you're close enough to retirement age where you have a pretty good idea of what your resources are going to look like. You can make an informed decision about how much resource availability you can allocate to solve this problem. You have a little bit better idea of probably where you're going to choose to retire. I didn't mention this earlier. I mentioned this.
No, I don't think we mentioned that, but let's go ahead and talk about it now.
Yeah. So care costs are wildly variant based on where you reside. Some states have a very low cost of care. Some states have a very high cost of care. And I know that I can't ask you the trivia question because we've done this presentation in the past. But the trivia question that I would put out to the audience is, for just 1 second here, think about, of all the states in the US, where do you think it's the most expensive to receive care? Most of the time, the snap answers we get back are New York and California. But the answer is actually Alaska. And it's because of just simple supply and demand economics. There's demand up in Alaska, but there's almost no supply of caregivers and care beds. Places like California, New York, yeah, they're still expensive because the cost of living there is expensive, but there's a little bit better balance of supply and demand. Some of the most affordable places to receive care are places like Texas and places like Arizona and Florida, because those states have very high retiree populations. So as a result, the marketplace has said, you know what, this is probably a good place for us to have a good supply of facilities and people working in that field. There are free resources you can consult if you're looking at what the cost of care is in an area that you plan to live or retire. Genworth does a cost of care survey every year. Genworth used to be one of the biggest long-term care insurers in the industry. They exited, 4 or 5 years ago now. But they still put out the cost of care survey every year. And you can just go out, just do a Google search for Genworth cost of care, and you'll get the current year's information. And you can really drill down to specific areas within a state even. The cost of care in Buffalo, New York is different than the cost of care in New York City. You can look at it at that fine a point for any of the states in the US. So that's worth knowing and just thinking about, like, what is the cost of care that I expect to have? And it does break it down by different care settings too. So you have your average cost for a private nursing home room, semi-private, assisted living facility monthly cost, home health care hourly rate. But to answer your question in a very roundabout way, generally when you're in your 50s, that's about the right time to start thinking about it. Put a solution in place, when you're still young enough and healthy enough to take advantage of good rates. Give yourself some time. Again, inflation protection, the earlier you start, the more years of compounding that benefit will have before you need care. I will say, there's not necessarily an endpoint on planning, but the endpoint, which for anybody on this line is probably not terribly relevant anyway, because you all get aged out by your employers, by the FAA. The endpoint would be, I'd say 70. It's really tough to try to put together a good long-term care plan when you have somebody who's over 70, just because the insurance costs end up being fairly significant. Now, if you have significant assets and income, might still make sense, but you lose a lot of leverage between, say, 58 and 70.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for all of your thoughts today, and I appreciate the trivia question. I didn't remember it from last time, so actually it was a surprise. I was going to say Florida.
Florida's got tons of caregivers, so they've got actually they have a very reasonable cost of care in Florida.
Interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that when you think about seniors, that's where you think I'm in Georgia, so I think about everyone going down to Florida to be with that population. All right. Well, thank you so much. I want to again thank you and the organization that have made this webinar possible today. I want to thank our attendees and look for a link to the replay of this event in your email. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you at another webinar soon. Goodbye, everyone.